As uncontrolled panic spread through all Arab quarters, the Israelis brought up jeeps with loudspeakers, which broadcast recorded horror sounds. These included shrieks, wails, and anguished moans of Arab women, the wail of sirens and the clang of fire alarm bells, interrupted by a sepulchral voice calling out in Arabic, "Save your souls, all ye faithful. The Jews are using poison gas and atomic weapons. Run for your lives in the name of Allah." Leo Heyman, Israeli Army Reserve officer. The Six-Day War augmented tension between the already hostile situation involving the Arabs and the Israelis. This conflict left many unsettled quarrels between the two sides. Eventually, these arguments built up to the Yom Kippur War, which would lead to the deaths of over 15,000 Israeli and Arab soldiers. On September 17, 1978, 5 years later, Egyptian President Anwar Sadat and Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin each signed the Camp David Accords, which would leave a lasting impression on both factions of the century-old dispute. In Sinai, Egyptians could not move past the narrow strip of land. If they did, they would lose the protection of the surface-to-air missiles. Anticipating Israeli armored counterattack, Egyptians armed themselves with anti-tank weapons supplied by the Soviets. Eventually, the Egyptians advanced 15 kilometers into the Sinai Desert, proving that their forces were capable of matching Israeli power. On October 8th, Shmuel Gonen, commander of the Israeli Southern Front, ordered a counterattack against the entrenched Egyptian forces at Hezion. Many Israeli troops lost their lives that day. Soon afterwards, it became clear that neither side wanted to initiate a large attack against the other. On October 14th, Sadat ordered his generals to mobilize and initiate an offensive strike. They suffered many losses due to this battle. On October 15th, Israel launched its counterattack. Israelis attacked the Egyptian weak point, the seam between the Egyptian Second Army and the Egyptian Third Army in the south. The Israelis opened up a hole in the Egyptian lines and reached the Suez Canal. The troops ferried across the canal with no armor, but supplied with American-made rockets. After the anti-aircraft and the anti-tank forces were destroyed, Israeli tanks and aircrafts could freely take control of the fight. Israelis deployed their pontoon bridge over the canal on October 16th. Israeli armies rushed south to cut off the Egyptian army before it reached Egypt. Another section was deployed to destroy Egyptian surface-to-air missiles. By October 19th, Israeli forces had constructed 4 separate bridges north of the Great Bitter Lake. By the end of the war, Israelis were in Egypt, about 101 kilometers from Cairo. In the Golan Heights, 180 Israeli tanks faced 1,300 Syrian tanks. Israel gave the fighting in the Golan Heights the highest priority. The army reserves were immediately sent to the Golan Heights. Just like the Egyptians in Sinai, the Syrians stayed under the cover of their surface-to-air missile batteries. Syrians also used Soviet-provided anti-tank weapons. After 4 days of fighting, the Israeli forces still held control of the northern flank of the headquarters, Nafah. Syrians almost conquered Nafah, but for some reason stopped on the fences, letting the Israeli forces assemble a defensive line. The southern Israeli forces, on the other hand, began to take heavy casualties. However, as reinforcements arrived, Israel forces pushed Syrians out of the Golan Heights. Eventually, by October 10th, Syrian forces were finally behind the pre-war line. The Israeli High Command decided to push into Syria itself. From October 11th to October 14th, Israeli forces pushed so far that they were able to shell the outskirts of Damascus. On October 22nd, Israeli forces recaptured the outpost on Mount Hermon after suffering some casualties. On October 22nd, the Security Council of the UN passed Resolution 338, calling for both sides to stop fighting and terminate all military actions. The ceasefire proposal was largely negotiated between the US and the Soviet Union. When the ceasefire had started, the Israelis were almost at their goal, the road linking Cairo and the Suez Canal. During the night, Egyptians violated the ceasefire and destroyed 9 Israeli tanks. In response, Israel troops marched south, gaining access of the road and trapping the Egyptian Third Army east of the Suez Canal. On October 23rd, Diplomatic activity occurred between the Soviets and the US. The Soviets saw that the Israeli forces were moving south and accused them of treachery. The US realized that the Egyptian army had no supply of food or water. The US was the only thing stopping the Israelis from destroying the Egyptians. This would help the US mediate the dispute. The US told the Israelis not to attack. Soon afterwards, the Soviet Union threatened that it would intervene on Egypt's behalf. US immediately raised its defense condition and threatened that if the Soviets intervened, so would the US. The Soviets decided not to go against the US and agreed to the Arab defeat. The next morning, the Egyptians agreed to the US suggestion. Meanwhile, Syrian and Iraqi troops were planning a counterattack in the north. However, when news came that Egypt had agreed to the ceasefire, the Syrians decided not to attack. Even though the ceasefire was accepted, it did not stop the small clashes among the border. The Egyptian army was being held hostage, forcing the Egyptians to enter negotiations. In return, the Israelis had to allow non-military supplies to reach the army and to agree to a complete ceasefire. A conference took place on October 28th, and a summit was held in Geneva. Israelis signed a pullback of troops on January 14th. However, small fights still continued. Eventually, the United Nations Disengagement and Observer Force was deployed as a peacekeeping force in Golan. On January 20th, 1977, President Jimmy Carter decided to end the conflicts going on between Israel and its neighbors. President Carter's new approach called for the reconvening of the 1973 Geneva Convention. By the end of his first year as president, President Carter had already met with the leaders of the Arab nations. In May of 1977, Menachem Begin became the leader of Israel while successfully beating the long-standing Alignment Party in the elections. Meanwhile, Anwar Sadat, the Egyptian president, became frustrated over the Geneva Convention. He thought the Geneva talks were taking too long. Therefore, in a series of secret meetings that the US was unaware of, Sadat became the first Egyptian president to visit Israel, thereby recognizing Israel as a nation. By this point, both leaders saw how negotiations might benefit their country. From September 5th to September 17th, Begin and Sadat convened at Camp David in Maryland, which marked the start of several tense and dramatic negotiations. Carter made it sure that a peace agreement would be reached. He talked with the leaders one-on-one, since the two had different perspectives on the issue at hand. Ultimately, after many days of tough negotiations, the terms of the agreement were finally set up. The first element of the initial agreement included the framework needed to set up an autonomous self-governing authority in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. It also said that peace must be upheld and Israeli troops must pull out of the disputed area. The second section dealt with Egyptian-Israeli relations, while the third component said that these peace principles should apply to Israel and all of its Arab neighbors. The second agreement stated that Israel would withdraw its armed forces from the Sinai Peninsula, evacuate its 4,500 civilian inhabitants, and restore the area to Egypt. In return, Israel would get freedom of passage through the Suez Canal and other nearby waterways. In addition, a restriction on the Egyptian forces would take place in the Sinai Peninsula. Israel would also agree to limit its forces by transporting its troops to a farther distance from the Egyptian border, and to guarantee free passage between Egypt and Jordan. This peace treaty would result to Sadat's assassination and Egypt losing its place in the Arab League. However, even with these repercussions, these accords would pave the way for later Israeli-Arab agreements. The Yom Kippur War lasted for a mere 20 days, yet its impact left a legacy of bloodshed and terror in the Middle East. Thousands of soldiers were massacred in the various battles throughout the war. However, this war was imperative for setting the stage for later compromises, such as the Camp David Accords. Although these accords failed to maintain a long-lasting peace, they succeeded in creating a considerable amount of time during which there was no turmoil in the Middle East. The significance of this conflict and subsequent compromise will forever be embedded in the archives of Middle Eastern history.